Friends, we meet again at a time when global power, politics, economics, and imperial strategies are colliding in ways both familiar and entirely new. What's unfolding today in the Caribbean off the Venezuelan coast is more than just another regional confrontation. Today, the story unfolding in the Caribbean and off the Venezuelan coast has become a symbol of what I call the new global reordering, the unraveling of a unipolar world dominated by the United States, and the birth of a multipolar balance that Washington can no longer fully control. The news that Venezuela has deployed Russia-made ship-killer missiles even as U.S. warships patrol nearby waters has set off a wave of anxiety in Washington. But this event isn't isolated. It's a reflection of the deeper economic and geopolitical shifts that define our age. Let's unpack this moment not as a single confrontation, but as an expression of decades of policies, contradictions, and power struggles that have shaped the modern capitalist world system. When we hear headlines about missiles deployments or Trump tightening his grip on Venezuela, we must always ask what lies beneath. Beneath the military hardware and the diplomatic posturing is an economic struggle, a battle over oil sovereignty, and the right to control one's own resources. Venezuela, along one of the world's richest nations in terms of crude reserves, has been under relentless economic siege from the United States for years. Sanctions have crippled its financial system, cut off trade, and isolated it from global markets. Yet, it is precisely under that pressure that we now see a new alliance taking shape. It's a microcosm of a larger transformation, what I would call the global reordering of power. The old unipolar world, long dominated by the United States, is giving way to something far more complex, far less controllable, a multipolar system. And with this shift, Washington's long-held ability to dictate outcomes across the planet is being tested like never before. News has spread that Venezuela, a nation once treated as a client state of the U.S., has now deployed advanced Russian-made anti-ship missiles even as American warships patrol nearby waters. It's a development that has rattled Washington, and for good reason. But what we must understand is that this is not a random provocation or an isolated act of defiance. It's part of a deeper historical and economic process, the result of decades of imperial strategy, economic warfare, and shifting global alliances. Beneath the military maneuvers, beneath the rhetoric of security and democracy lies the real battle, one over resources, sovereignty, and the right of nations to control their own destinies. Venezuela sits atop some of the world's richest oil reserves, a fact that has always made it both valuable and vulnerable. For decades, Washington's influence over global oil pricing, dollar dominance, and trade routes gave it near total leverage. But over the past 2 decades, that grip has weakened when the United States imposed economic sanctions on Venezuela, cutting off trade, freezing assets, and strangling its access to global markets. It believed it could force the government in Caracas to submit. Instead, the opposite happened. Under pressure, Venezuela turned outward and eastward. It began building ties with Russia, China, Iran, and other nations also wary of Washington's dominance. In effect, the very sanctions designed to isolate Venezuela have helped to forge a counter-network, a coalition of nations challenging the USA-centric global order. From an economist perspective, this is crucial. What's emerging here isn't just an ideological or military confrontation. It's an economic realignment. It's about who controls markets, energy flows, and the financial systems that sustain global capitalism. For over 70 years, the American empire rested on a simple foundation: control oil, price it in dollars, and use military dominance to secure shipping routes. That formula gave the U.S. not only immense wealth, but global influence. Today, for the first time since the Second World War, that model is under threat. The deployment of Russian missile systems in Venezuela is a geopolitical signal, a declaration that Washington's sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere enshrined in the old Monroe Doctrine, is no longer sacrosanct. When Donald Trump reinstated harsh sanctions and tightened his administration's grip on Venezuela, he expected economic pain to bring submission. Instead, that pain pushed Venezuela into the arms of America's rivals. Russia saw an opportunity not only to sell weapons, but to extend its strategic reach into a region long considered off limits. Chinese firms, meanwhile, deepened investments in Venezuelan oil infrastructure. Iran, defying U.S. naval patrols, sent tanker after tanker with desperately needed fuel. The message from Caracas was clear: the age of unilateral control is over. Now, when Americans hear of Russian ship-killer missiles on Venezuelan soil, they often imagine a direct threat, the possibility of confrontation so close to home. But for many Venezuelans, and indeed for much of the global South, those missiles are symbols of sovereignty. They represent the right of a small sanctioned nation to defend itself against decades of external coercion. And for the first time in a long time, the psychological balance has shifted. The U.S. Navy, long accustomed to patrolling the Caribbean unchallenged, must now acknowledge the possibility of real resistance. To grasp the full significance of this shift, we must turn to history. During the Cold War, Washington treated Latin America as its own private domain. Any government that dared to pursue socialist or nationalist policies was met with intervention. Military coups and child-covered operations in Nicaragua, blockades in Cuba, Venezuela's Bolivarian Revolution, first under Hugo Chávez and later under Nicolas Maduro, inherited that same legacy of resistance. But unlike earlier movements, Caracas adapted its defiance to a globalized economy. It sought new trade partners, new technologies, and new financial systems, ones that bypass the U.S. dollar entirely. This is what truly threatens Washington, not a few missile batteries, but a structural shift away from the dollar-dominated order. Let's pause on that. The dollar is more than currency. It's an instrument of power. It allows the United States to impose economic blockades, control global transactions, and punish adversaries without firing a single shot. Yet, the overuse of this weapon is backfiring. Every sanctioned country, Russia, China, Iran, and now Venezuela, is developing alternatives. New payment systems, bilateral trade in local currencies, and digital reserve mechanisms are emerging. Each step weakens dollar dependency. From an economic standpoint, this marks a tectonic transition, the slow but steady erosion of the financial empire that sustained U.S. hegemony since 1945. Now, let's return to the present moment. American warships in the Caribbean, framed as part of anti-narcotics missions, serve another purpose, entirely power projection. It's a reminder to the world and to U.S. voters that Washington still commands the seas. Yet even that dominance is no longer absolute. The Russian-made missile systems stationed along Venezuela's coast were designed precisely to deter advanced naval fleets. Their range, precision, and mobility make them formidable. More importantly, their presence alters the strategic psychology of the region. For the first time, a U.S. task force operating in the Western Hemisphere faces the reality of possible resistance, a challenge to its sense of invulnerability. Trump's Venezuela strategy was built on nostalgia, the belief that sanctions and cover pressure could recreate Cold War-style outcomes. But the global economy no longer operates under those conditions. Supply chains are globalized, energy routes diversified, and major powers now respond to U.S. coercion with collective defiance. When Washington blocked Venezuelan crude exports, Russian firms stepped in. When U.S. sanctions choked off fuel imports, Iran delivered. Each countermeasure weakened America's monopoly on enforcement. What we're seeing is the unraveling of unilateral power in a multipolar system. From a Marxian economic lens, this is the predictable outcome of imperial overreach. The U.S. capitalist class, accustomed to unchallenged global dominance, now faces competitors it cannot easily suppress. And rather than adapt, it doubles down through tariffs, sanctions, and militarized diplomacy. These are not signs of confidence, but of crisis. They expose a deeper structural weakness. An economic system hollowed out by decades of outsourcing and financial speculation, one that can no longer sustain its imperial ambitions without externalizing its costs. Meanwhile, nations like Venezuela and Russia are building new forms of economic resilience. Cut off from Western credit markets, they are turning inward, developing local production, trading outside dollar systems, and investing in regional self-sufficiency. These strategies are spreading across the global south. One by one, nations are learning to function without dependence on Western finance. That, more than any missile or naval maneuver, is what signals the true end of unipolarity. Empires rarely fall in a single dramatic event. They erode through countless small acts of defiance, each trade agreement, each alternative bank, each refusal to obey sanctions adding up to a global transformation. We stand then at the threshold of a new era, one defined not by ideological blocks, but by economic sovereignty and strategic pluralism. Venezuela's partnership with Russia is not merely a tactical alliance. It is a prototype for a future where power is shared, contested, and negotiated among equals, not dictated from one capital. As we move deeper into this unfolding drama between Caracas and Washington, the military symbolism often overshadows the economic and historical depth beneath it. The deployment of Russian-made anti-ship missiles along Venezuela's coastline is not simply an act of defiance. It is a declaration of economic independence wrapped in strategic language. To fully grasp its meaning, we must understand how the world's most powerful empire reached a point where it faces resistance in its own hemisphere. The roots of this confrontation lie not only in political ideology, but in the fundamental contradictions of global capitalism, contradictions that have now matured into a direct geopolitical challenge for over a century. U.S. power rested on two pillars: the global dominance of the dollar and control over the international energy system. Oil was the lifeblood of modern industry, and whoever controlled its flow effectively controlled the pace of global capitalism. Washington's strength came from its ability to price oil in dollars, enforce that standard through its alliances with Saudi Arabia and Western Europe, and secure trade through its unmatched navy. But this arrangement, so stable during the Cold War, is breaking apart under the weight of globalization's own consequences. The American industrial base has hollowed out. Its corporations move production overseas in search of cheap labor and higher profits. Meanwhile, the same globalization that enriched U.S. multinationals also empowered other nations to rise. China became the world's factory. Russia re-emerged as an energy superpower, and smaller states like Venezuela found new patrons who could offset Washington's coercion. This is what makes the present crisis so profound. When Trump's administration imposed wave after wave of sanctions, it believed it could suffocate Venezuela's socialist experiment. But sanctions, while devastating everyday citizens, rarely achieve their intended political outcomes. Instead, they reconfigure alliances. Venezuela, once tethered to Western markets, reoriented itself toward Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. This alignment was not ideological in the Cold War sense. It was practical, born out of necessity. The sanctioned nations realized they shared a common interest: survival outside the dollar system. Together, they began building the infrastructure for an alternative global order: trade in national currencies, shared financial networks, and technological cooperation beyond Western control. In Washington, these developments are often dismissed as symbolic or temporary, but history shows that economic alternatives once created tend to endure. The euro, the yuan, even the digital ruble, all are small cracks in the dollar's armor. But when combined with resource-sharing agreements like those between Russia and Venezuela, those cracks widen. The American empire, so confident in its financial supremacy, now finds itself facing a world increasingly capable of saying no. The weaponization of finance, sanctions, embargoes, exclusion from WFT once guaranteed U.S. compliance. Now, each time it is used, it breeds resistance and innovation. Economically speaking, this is the dialectic of imperial decline. The very tools of control become catalysts for disobedience. In Venezuela's case, sanctions forced the state to become inventive. The government began trading oil for machinery, food, and medicine. It revived agricultural production long neglected under the oil economy. Russian and Chinese firms helped modernize its energy infrastructure, while Iranian engineers refurbished refineries crippled by embargoes. None of this reversed the hardships faced by the population, but it demonstrated a critical truth: economic survival outside the Western orbit is possible. Each successful adaptation diminishes the myth of absolute U.S. economic power. From a geopolitical standpoint, Russia's presence in Venezuela represents both deterrence and symbolism. For Moscow, it is a calculated move to project influence in America's backyard, echoing, though inverted, the logic of NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe. For Venezuela, it is a shield against regime change and an opportunity to anchor itself in a broader anti-hegemonic alliance. The missiles themselves, advanced coastal defense systems capable of targeting warships over hundreds of kilometers, are less about offense and more about signaling we are not defenseless. For Washington, accustomed to uncontested dominance in the Western Hemisphere, this is an uncomfortable realization. The notion that U.S. naval forces could face credible opposition so close to home disrupts not just strategy but psychology. But let's remember, military deterrence is only the surface layer. Beneath it lies the real contest. Who controls the global flow of value? The American economic system thrives on dependency, nations exporting raw materials, borrowing in dollars, importing finished goods. Any country that challenges this hierarchy invites punishment. Venezuela's attempt to nationalize its oil and redistribute wealth was intolerable, not because it failed economically, but because it dared to assert autonomy within a system built on dependency. The reaction, financial isolation, media demonization, and political subversion was predictable, yet by surviving, Venezuela exposed the limits of empire. In Marxian terms, this is the contradiction of mature capitalism. The pursuit of profit demands expansion, but expansion generates rivals. Each new global market integrated under capitalism eventually develops the capacity to resist it. This is what we are witnessing today. The economic order that once bound the world to the dollar is now producing its own alternatives. The free market myth has turned against its creators. When sanctions pushed Venezuela to seek new partners, when Russia and China built institutions like the Brias Bank, when energy trade began shifting to local currencies, each act chipped away at the old hierarchy. The empire's greatest strength, its economic interconnectedness, has become the mechanism of its decline inside the United States. This transformation is invisible to many. Political discourse remains trapped in nostalgia, with leaders clinging to the belief that America can bring manufacturing back or reassert dominance. Yet, the structural reality is that global capitalism has evolved beyond U.S. control. The very corporations that once fueled national prosperity now owe allegiance only to profit, not country. They produce a broad bank offshore and influence policy at home to protect their global interests. The empire, in effect, is being eaten from within by its own capitalist class. Meanwhile, in Latin America, a quiet but profound shift is taking place. Nations long subjected to IMF austerity and U.S. intervention are rediscovering sovereignty. Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, each is exploring trade mechanisms independent of Washington. Venezuela, though battered, stands as both a warning and an inspiration. Defiance has costs, but submission has chains. And as global energy markets evolve with renewable investments and new regional corridors, control over oil, once the empire's greatest weapon, is no longer absolute. The economic chessboard is far more complex than it was a generation ago. For Washington, this is the real danger, not the missiles themselves, but the example they set. If a sanctioned struggling nation can resist through alliances and adaptation, others will follow. The fast aid of inevitability that once surrounded U.S. power begins to crack. Every new trade deal outside the dollar, every successful bypass of sanctions, every act of defiance erodes the aura of invincibility that underpins empire. This in turn weakens the domestic narrative, the belief that American global leadership is both moral and permanent. When that narrative falters, the system begins to question itself. The United States still possesses immense military and economic power, but power without legitimacy becomes brittle. Empires rarely collapse from defeat alone. They erode from disbelief. The spectacle of U.S. warships circling Venezuelan waters, while its own infrastructure decays and inequality deepens at home, reveals a deeper crisis, one of purpose. The missiles in Venezuela are not the real threat to Washington's dominance. The real threat is the growing realization at home and abroad that the empire's reach exceeds its grasp. By the time Washington realized the depth of its miscalculation, the geopolitical board had already shifted. The world it once commanded through financial leverage and military projection had diversified not through ideology, but through exhaustion. Nations were tired of living under the constant threat of secondary sanctions, asset freezes, and arbitrary trade restrictions dictated from afar. The rise of multipolarity wasn't an accident. It was a survival strategy, a natural response to decades of coercive dependence. Venezuela's defiance, reinforced by Russian technical support and Chinese financial aid, became a small but potent symbol of this larger historical transformation. To understand this shift, one must revisit the mythology of the rules-based international order. For decades, Washington portrayed itself as the custodian of global stability, the architect of free trade, and the defender of democracy. Yet, the very architecture of this order was designed to ensure American primacy. Institutions like the IMF and World Bank were instruments of structural compliance, offering loans that came with political strings, liberalizing economies while keeping them dependent on Western capital for much of the developing world. Integration meant surrendering economic sovereignty in exchange for temporary stability. But when the system began to fail, when debt crisis spiraled, when austerity gutted social services, when Washington's own interventions toppled governments, the illusion fractured. The so-called rules began to look less like shared norms and more like imperial decrees. Russia and China, observing this disillusionment, moved to fill the vacuum. They didn't promise moral superiority. They offered alternatives, infrastructure loans without political conditions, energy partnerships based on mutual need rather than dominance. The Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, the BICE Alliance, all of these emerged as mechanisms of escape from a suffocating unipolar order. And while critics in the West dismissed them as authoritarian projects, many countries saw them as pragmatic paths to autonomy. Venezuela's partnership with Russia, for instance, wasn't about ideology. It was about survival. When cut off from U.S. banking systems, Venezuelan oil still found buyers through shadow networks facilitated by Moscow and Beijing. Tankers switched flags. Payments flowed through cryptocurrencies and alternative clearing systems, and slowly a parallel economic ecosystem began to take form. This evolution reveals something profound about power in the 21st century. It's no longer defined solely by military capability or GDP size, but by connectivity. Whoever controls the networks of trade finance and data controls the modern world. The United States built those networks. SUBOFT for banking, GPS for navigation, Visa and MasterCard for transactions, big tech for communication. And for years, this gave it unmatched influence. But in weaponizing these systems to punish rivals, Washington inadvertently encouraged others to build replacements. Russia developed SPS, its own interbank network. China launched CIPs and the digital yuan, and even allies like India and Brazil began exploring bilateral payment frameworks outside the dollar. Each of these developments might seem incremental, but collectively they signify a monumental shift. The empire's monopoly over global exchange, its true source of power, is dissolving. The geopolitical implications are staggering. Consider the energy trade. For decades, every barrel of oil was effectively a financial instrument of U.S. power, priced in dollars and cleared through American banks. This gave Washington immense leverage, the ability to sanction nations, freeze assets, and manipulate inflation across borders. But once oil starts trading in multiple currencies, yuan, rubles, rupees, that leverage weakens. When Russia began selling discounted crude to India and China after the Ukraine conflict, the payments weren't in dollars. They were in local currencies. This single act, multiplied across dozens of transactions, represents the slow erosion of what economists call exorbitant privilege. The dollar's status as the world's default currency, Venezuela, following this pattern, now exports oil and gold through barter and non-dollar settlements, effectively bypassing the very mechanisms meant to control it. This is not the end of American power, but it marks the end of its exclusivity. What we are witnessing is the normalization of defiance, the ability of nations to exist, trade, and grow outside the USD-centric system. And once defiance becomes normalized, empire loses its psychological grip. This is why the deployment of missiles in Venezuela triggered panic in Washington. It wasn't about the missiles themselves. They are defensive, limited in range, and incapable of altering the global balance. The real fear lies in what they symbolize: the return of multipolarity to the Western Hemisphere. For the first time in decades, Latin America is no longer a geopolitical monolith under U.S. influence. From Mexico's diplomatic neutrality to Brazil's re-engagement with BICS, from Argentina's yuan settlements to Bolivia's lithium deals with China, the continent is diversifying its dependencies, and Venezuela stands at the crossroads of this transformation. For Russia, this alignment is strategic theater. By partnering with Venezuela, it sends a message that Moscow can project influence beyond Europe, that it can contest Washington's dominance not just near its borders, but in its own backyard. For China, its economic calculus. By investing in Latin American infrastructure, telecommunications, and energy, Beijing is securing long-term access to resources while expanding its geopolitical footprint. For the United States, however, the implications are existential. The Monroe Doctrine, once the sacred blueprint of hemispheric control, is quietly dying. The idea that the Americas are an exclusive sphere of U.S. influence no longer align with global reality. And yet Washington's response remains anchored in nostalgia. It continues to interpret defiance as subversion, opposition as illegitimacy. Instead of adapting to a world of multiple centers of power, it doubles down on old habits, sanctions, military posturing, covert interference. But these tools, once effective, now carry diminishing returns. Every sanction drives nations closer to one another. Every military threat invites new alliances. Every denunciation of authoritarianism sounds hollow when juxtaposed with domestic political dysfunction and endless wars. The moral authority that once legitimized American dominance has eroded, replaced by cynicism both at home and abroad. Within the U.S., this imperial fatigue manifests as polarization. Citizens no longer see empire as glory, but as burden. The trillions spent on wars, the stagnation of wages, the crumbling of infrastructure, all fuel disillusionment. When ordinary Americans look at interventions abroad, they no longer see national pride. They see squandered opportunity. This internal erosion mirrors the external decline. No empire can sustain global dominance when its domestic foundations are cracking. The gap between Washington's ambitions and its capabilities grows wider with each passing year. And Venezuela's defiance, though small in scale, exposes that contradiction with brutal clarity. It's also worth noting that this is not just a geopolitical realignment, it's a civilizational one. The West, long the center of economic innovation and cultural authority, is now being challenged by the rest. A coalition of nations that refuses to be defined by Western paradigms. The concept of development itself is being reinterpreted, no longer measured by Western approval, but by national resilience and sovereignty. Venezuela's alliance with Russia and China, therefore, isn't merely a political maneuver. It's a declaration that the global South can chart its own course, even under pressure, even in defiance of the most powerful nation on earth. As the world fragments into spheres of influence, the question is no longer whether the U.S. can regain control, but whether it can adapt to sharing it. Empires throughout history have faced this moment. Rome with its overstretched legions, Britain with its exhausted colonies, and now America with its declining moral and financial supremacy. The test of this century will be whether Washington can transform dominance into coexistence, or whether, blinded by nostalgia, it clings to an order that no longer exists. And this is where Venezuela's quiet resilience becomes emblematic. It's not a superpower. It doesn't possess the resources or the reach to reshape the world alone, but its defiance marks a turning point, a signal that the age of unilateral empire is ending. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, contributes to the momentum of history. And history, as it stands today, is no longer written solely in Washington or Wall Street. It is being rewritten in Caracas, Moscow, Beijing, and beyond. One oil shipment, one trade deal, one missile battery at a time. By the dawn of the new decade, the consequences of America's lost grip over the global energy battlefield were unmistakable. The world had reorganized itself, not through a coordinated rebellion, but through a quiet, methodical disentanglement from U.S. control. Each sanction, each embargo, each ultimatum that Washington issued in defense of its so-called values became a catalyst for the construction of alternatives. The age of monopoly had ended, not with a bang, but with the steady hum of new pipelines, new currencies, and new alliances forming outside the reach of the old empire. At the center of this transformation was a brutal paradox in trying to preserve its dominance. America accelerated its decline. When Washington cut Russia out of the Western energy system, it assumed Moscow would collapse. Instead, Russia redirected its exports to Asia, forming what analysts now call the energy Silk Road. Crude flowed eastward. Liquefied natural gas terminals expanded across the Arctic and Pacific, and pipelines, once built for Europe, now served new markets. The ruble, once fragile, found new stability in commodities. Moscow had turned sanctions into strategy, a model soon copied by others. Meanwhile, the Gulf states, long regarded as reliable U.S. partners, began to hedge their bets. Saudi Arabia, the linchpin of the petrodollar system, started accepting payments in yuan. The UAE deepened trade with India and China. Even Qatar, once home to the largest U.S. military base in the region, diversified its contracts away from Western firms. What emerged was a pattern. The energy map was being redrawn, and for the first time in generations, it didn't orbit around Washington. The petrodollar's grip on the global economy began to loosen imperceptibly at first, then unmistakably. To grasp the scale of this shift, one must recall how deeply energy and empire were intertwined. The 20th century's great powers rose and fell not merely through wars or politics, but through control of energy. Oil determined industrial capacity, military reach, and financial leverage. The United States ascended to hegemony not just because of its military might, but because it controlled the arteries of global energy. From the fields of the Middle East to the shipping lanes of the Atlantic, every barrel of oil priced in dollars strengthened its currency. Every sanction on an adversary reinforced its dominance. But as the century turned, that foundation began to crack. Renewable technologies, digital currencies, and regional alliances diluted the power of oil and, by extension, the power of the dollar. When Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, all major energy producers, found themselves simultaneously under sanctions, they did not collapse. They coordinated. Their collective survival mechanisms became the prototype for a post-Stall world. Consider the case of Russia and Venezuela's partnership in refining and export logistics. Both nations, battered by Western restrictions, began developing shared supply route shadow fleets and barter-based settlements using gold, crypto, and regional currencies. The result wasn't chaos, it was adaptation. What the West saw as evasion, the rest of the world saw as innovation. This quiet ingenuity, replicated across multiple regions, slowly eroded the enforcement capacity of U.S. sanctions. The empire that once weaponized globalization was now being outmaneuvered by it. The deeper story, however, is not economic, it's psychological. For decades, the American establishment operated on the assumption that its moral authority would ensure compliance, that nations would align with its leadership out of belief. Not just necessity, but belief is fragile, and once lost, it doesn't return. The wars in Iraq and Libya, the chaos in Afghanistan, the double standards on human rights. All of these eroded the myth of benevolent leadership. Countries no longer saw the U.S. as the guardian of stability, but as a source of volatility. When Washington demanded loyalty, many simply smiled politely and pursued their own interests. The fear that once maintained order had been replaced by calculation. Even in Europe, the traditional bastion of Atlanticism, this fatigue grew. The continent's dependence on American security guarantees came at the cost of strategic autonomy. When Washington pressured its allies to cut off Russian gas, Europe obeyed, but it paid a devastating price: spiraling energy costs, industrial decline, and inflation. Factories closed in Germany, protests erupted in France, and discontent simmered in Italy. The very order built on unity began to fracture under economic strain. For the first time since the Cold War, European citizens openly questioned whether alignment with Washington was worth the cost. In this sense, the loss of the global energy battlefield wasn't just about oil or gas, it was about legitimacy. The empire's credibility was dissolving, and with it the foundation of its alliances. Meanwhile, China quietly consolidated its advantage. As the U.S. obsessed over military containment, Beijing built what some analysts now call the energy belt, a web of refineries, ports, and pipelines stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Pacific. It secured long-term energy contracts with Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran denominated in non-dollar terms. While Washington warned of Chinese expansionism, Beijing offered what many nations saw as partnership without lecture. It didn't demand ideological conformity. It offered development. It didn't deploy troops. It built infrastructure. And for much of the developing world, that difference was profound. In a world wary of conditional aid and endless wars, China's model appeared pragmatic, even humane. For Washington, this was more than a strategic setback. It was an identity crisis. The U.S. had long defined itself as the indispensable nation, the architect of global order. To lose control over the flow of energy, the literal bloodstream of modern civilization, was to lose the essence of that role. Its foreign policy establishment, steeped in the logic of containment and deterrence, struggled to comprehend the new reality. Power was no longer about who could blockade whom, it was about who could connect with whom. The pipelines, ports, and currencies of the new order represented not rebellion but evolution, a world growing beyond its old overseer. Yet, even in decline, America remains formidable. Its technological capacity, military reach, and cultural influence are unmatched, but hegemony once lost cannot be restored by strength alone. The question now is whether Washington can accept a world where it leads by cooperation rather than coercion. History suggests that empires rarely make that transition gracefully. Rome tried to hold its provinces through force and crumbled. Britain clung to colonial trade, dominance, and exhausted itself. The U.S., now standing at a similar crossroads, faces the same dilemma: adapt or fade. At home, the symptoms of imperial fatigue are visible in everything from partisan dysfunction to economic inequality. The resources once devoted to building the empire's outer walls are now insufficient to maintain its inner foundations. Infrastructure crumbles while defense budgets soar. Public trust erodes while surveillance expands. The contradiction is unsustainable. A nation cannot preach democracy abroad while struggling to uphold it at home. And as domestic disillusionment deepens, the appetite for foreign intervention wanes. Americans are beginning to ask, what is the point of global supremacy if it no longer improves life at home? The world, meanwhile, moves on. Energy alliances are being redefined, currencies diversified, trade routes recalibrated. The system that once revolved around Washington now operates through multiple hubs: Moscow, Beijing, New Delhi, Riyadh. In this fluid new order, power is not absolute but relational, distributed across networks rather than hoarded by a single state. It is paradoxically more unstable, yet more balanced, a reflection of a planet too interconnected to be ruled by one capital alone. And so, as the U.S. watches its control over the global energy battlefield slip away, it faces a moment of reckoning. The end of dominance is not the end of relevance, but it demands humility, something great powers rarely possess. If Washington can learn to lead without dictating, to compete without coercing, and to influence without imposing, it may yet find a sustainable role in this emerging multipolar world. But if it continues to cling to the illusions of unipolarity, it risks repeating the fate of every empire that mistook control for stability. Because history, indifferent as ever, moves forward. The oil that once powered empires now powers independence. The currencies that once enforced submission now circulate in defiance, and the nations that once obeyed now negotiate. The battlefield has changed, and so has the balance. America may have lost control, but the world has gained freedom. Friends, as we reach the end of this analysis, it's important to take a step back from the headlines, from the noise of missiles, sanctions, and power plays, and recognize what this moment in history truly represents. What we are witnessing is not simply a shift in foreign policy or a regional dispute between the United States and Venezuela. It is the culmination of an entire era, the slow disintegration of a global system that once seemed immovable, and the emergence of something new, uncertain, but undeniably real: a multipolar world. For nearly 8 decades, U.S. dominance in global energy, trade, and finance defined the architecture of international power. The American century, born in the ashes of World War II, was built on 2 interlocking pillars: control over energy and control over money. Washington's military safeguarded the world's oil routes, and its financial system dictated the terms of exchange. Nations could rise, but only within limits approved by the empire. The rules-based order, as it was called, was in truth a hierarchy, and America stood proudly at the top. But history has no loyalty. The same tools that secured U.S. supremacy, sanctions, dollar dominance, military projection, have now become the instruments of its unraveling. By overusing them, Washington turned power into habit and habit into weakness. Every sanction created new alternatives. Every intervention fueled new resistance. Every lecture on democracy exposed new hypocrisies. The world did not collapse under American pressure. It adapted around it. And that adaptation is now reshaping the plan and its political and economic landscape. Venezuela's defiance, therefore, is not an isolated act of resistance, but a symptom of this wider transformation. When Caracas installed Russian anti-ship missiles, it wasn't just about deterrence. It was about dignity, a declaration that small nations need not bow before global giants. When Russia, China, and Iran came to its aid, they weren't merely supporting an ally. They were helping to build an architecture of resilience, an alternative world, imperfect and still forming, but one that no longer accepts a single center of control. Dr. Richard Wolff often reminds us that economics is not about numbers, it's about power, relationships, and who gets to decide. The U.S. once decided for everyone. It determined who could trade, who could borrow, who could rise, and who would fall. But that era is fading. Today, energy deals are struck in yuan and rubles, not just dollars. Regional banks handle settlements once dominated by Wall Street. The International Monetary Fund's influence is being challenged by the new development bank of BRICS. This isn't theoretical, it's material. The balance of power is shifting from a world of obedience to a world of negotiation. And yet we must recognize the cost. Transitions of this scale are never peaceful. The collapse of empires has always produced turmoil, uncertainty, and risk. The danger lies not in the decline of American hegemony, but in how it responds to that decline. History shows us that empires rarely go quietly. They mistake their fading dominance for betrayal, their loss of control for injustice. They lash out, seeking to reclaim what is already gone. The question before us then is not whether the U.S. will lose its monopoly on power. That process is already underway, but whether it will adapt with wisdom or fall with fury. Inside the United States, this global unraveling mirrors a domestic one. The wealth gap grows, infrastructure decays, democracy falters, and faith in institutions collapses. The same capitalist system that once projected stability abroad now breeds instability at home. The empire's power, once external, has turned inward, consuming the very society it was meant to protect. In this sense, Venezuela, Russia, and China are not just external adversaries. They are mirrors reflecting America's own contradictions. The obsession with dominance abroad distracts from decay within. So what happens next? The logical path forward is cooperation, a recognition that the 21st century cannot be ruled by the methods of the 20th. Climate change, pandemics, migration, and technology have bound humanity together in ways empires cannot untangle. The era of coercion must give way to an era of coordination. If the United States wishes to remain a leader, it must redefine leadership itself, not as control, but as partnership. True strength in the modern world lies not in domination, but in interdependence. Venezuela's stance, backed by Russian technology, Chinese capital, and Iranian resilience, signals that sovereignty in the new age will not come from isolation, but from collaboration among equals. It is not the end of globalization, but the birth of a new kind, one that is multipolar, multilingual, and multifaceted. The challenge for Washington is whether it can find a place in this new order without insisting on being its center. For those who worry about what comes after the fall of a superpower, history offers reassurance. When old systems break down, they make room for innovation. When monopolies collapse, creativity thrives. Just as the end of British dominance gave rise to American ingenuity, the winning of U.S. hegemony may open doors for a fairer, more balanced world economy. The end of one empire is not the end of progress. It is the beginning of possibility. But possibility demands humility, the arrogance of unipolar power, the belief that one nation, one ideology, or one currency could rule indefinitely has blinded policymakers for decades. To break that illusion is not to celebrate America's decline, but to invite its rebirth. A nation that once championed freedom can rediscover it not as domination abroad, but as justice at home. So when we hear about Russian missiles in Venezuela, let us not fixate on the fear they evoke, but on the message they carry. The world will no longer be ruled by force alone. Power is being redistributed, sovereignty reclaimed, and economies reimagined. This is the essence of the new era, one not of Cold War rivalry, but of systemic realignment. The United States can still play a central role, but not as a warden, as a participant. It can still lead, but through example, not coercion. The global energy battlefield may have escaped its grip, but leadership rooted in cooperation is still within reach. The only question left is whether America will learn from its history or repeat it. Because history, as Professor Wolff so often reminds us, is not neutral. It moves according to material forces that shape it: production, distribution, and power. And those forces have turned. The unipolar age is gone. The multipolar world is here. The sooner we understand that, the sooner we can shape it together. And so, friends, as the sun sets on one empire and rises on a new order, we are left with a choice: to cling to the illusions of the past or to build the realities of the future. The missiles in the Caribbean, the sanctions on Caracas, the tremors in global markets. They are not just symptoms of conflict, they are the sounds of history turning its page. The United States may have lost control over the global energy battlefield, but humanity may just have found the courage to share